O le whaamama awenga le nei ma le Pacific Isi, mo au tupe whaamumoli Samoa, a o tapuni ai ofisa mo le whaava yaso. Whaonga nei lola na wa unanga forward ta ua, o le direct transfer. A whai wa yesa membership card ma e whaonga ina le internet banking, o le matua e whaingo fia lava. Na o le tipose mai lava lau se leni matua account, o na whaatino leo la foina o lau se leni mo a inga I Samoa. E ia inga I tahu na whaamalia ina, mo nisi whaamatalanga I le nei au nanga fo. Wala au le telefoni o walu se lau o tasi o nono, po le lua fitu ono fitu iwa fitu wha. Pe text mai fo ilo suafa I le valu tolu o.
Local voucher is one of the most convenient ways that I'm finding now to do my shopping here at Mama Joe, and my sister just sent through the voucher on my cell phone, and I just come straight to Mama Joe do my shopping.
Ole si tulanga tukusili ole tau. Ole la fo me ole pa tala olo. Ona fa ngale fa tau o lo e nga mo ainga.
I think it's really convenient for families overseas if they don't know how to help their families here. Then this is the perfect way.
Mai ela sa so mo tau ele sia sa.
Ni fia foi sa we mo mawina nei foi au nang fo ala mai le talo for voucher. Ula wala fa tau ma me te mga oi. Ile voucher.
Dai mo le talo pa voucher o mo e posicio se o fine. So se para lo fa ngo fie. A me se le fer wa I ma le telefoni. Tai mi uma. Ai lo la po merkes ona ino do tamaore ainga.
Fa te tu la vole tal for voucher mo le foi au nang fo fa tai. Ma lo la le tam fai.
Pa tai talo pa voucher. Teki talo pa voucher.
Te honi ta pena, te malanga halu. Mo te ato lau, te holau.
Talofa and welcome to this edition of Pacific GeoPolitics. Tonight we will be exploring the issue of human rights, implications of climate change. My guest tonight is the Honorable Casten Nemra, the Foreign Minister of the Republic of Marshall Islands, and he will be discussing specifically the proposal by Marshall Islands towards the Human Rights Council earlier this year regarding the human rights implications of climate change. Thank you for joining us once again.
Well, first of all, congratulations on your address to the Human Rights Council. It was succinct, but also addressed a lot of very relevant and pressing issues for the Pacific Islands. So I know there are varied impacts of climate change in the Pacific Islands. But to start with, can you highlight the most severe human rights impacts of climate change on the Marshall Islands?
Well, first of all, thank you for having me, and it's my pleasure to take part on this interview. And with reference to your good question, well, obviously, coming from low-lying atolls, basically a few meters above the sea level, it's something we'll live by and through day and night on the effects of climate change, not only in terms of the sea level rise, but the change that surrounds the coastal and the corals, and obviously the drought. And these are becoming more frequent than ever. King tides are becoming more acute. Waterlands that often fresh are no longer the case. They become increased level of salinity and brackish. So all our surrounding is we're witnessing, especially the older generation from what it was before. So in short, the science is not there to tell us what's happening. We see it every day of what's happening. A good example, we have family industry graveyard, and there are a number of these graveyards are already eroded. They're simply disappeared. And these are 18th century graveyard that are usually by the coastal, and those are gone. simply disappeared because the water continued to erode the coastal side. And it's a sad cultural situation, but that's a reality here in the Marshall Islands.
Thank you. I mean, it sounds like it's cross-cutting in the way that it impacts the Marshall Islands. You highlighted that in your address to the Human Rights Council, you highlighted that Marshall Islands has acceded to 11 human rights instruments. Minister, can you elaborate on the significance of this in the context of the impact of climate change in your country?
Well, absolutely. Well, obviously there are universal rights, human rights, that is, and we pursue to become a member of the HR Council, and in fact, has opened up an office in Geneva. And to be able to be a contributing member, we have studied and tried to comply as much on the universal rights measures that are out there, mindful that they require resources, manpower, and whatnot. But simply put, we want to be fully compliant with human rights, so we should be in the position with the credibility to talk about human rights in relation to climate change. It's no point when we're violating various human rights while we're advocating for climate change human rights aspects. The two goes together, in fact, because from our whole livelihood, as far as here with Marshall Islands, our identity relates directly to the land. And when the land is eroded, it really brings the question of who you are as a person. And it does affect and violates a number of human rights to your own culture, to your identity, and let alone it begs the question of your nationality and country as a whole. This is a question for the scholars, for the legal minds that we have to grapple with today, not in the years to come. What happened if the Marshall Islands simply disappeared? Is it still a country, or is it simply a part of the ocean, bigger part of the Pacific Ocean? So we're in it. It's a crisis, and it's an urgent mode of work that, at least from the government, in particular the foreign affairs, it's part of our advocate policy to confront and advocate on climate change.
Thank you. So you touch on this issue of sea level rise and the implications on state sovereignty. And this is something that's now currently being addressed by the International Law Commission, or the ILC. They have established a committee to look into the impacts of sea level rise on islands and highlight some of the threats to atoll nations. Is RMI taking part in these discussions, and to what specific recourses under international law is your nation taking in respect to loss of territory?
Well, from a historical and archaeological standpoint, study shows that we've been here in the islands for the past 2 millennia. And we have every intent to stay here for the next 2 millennia. Let's put it that way. It's not an option for us to relocate or become so-called climate change refuge. It's something we don't accept. In fact, it's really degrading, and it's a direct violation of our well-being. And we're advocating, however, avenues, whether it be New York or Geneva or other capitals and other international and organizations, through the multilateral approach, and to put the argument there that this is our identity. We're the people who's been residing in these respective islands, and we're here to stay. The issue of climate change is a modern issue, and we have to come together and combat it and deal with it accordingly, legally and morally. But we have no intention whatsoever to relocate ourselves. It may be considered naive from others' point of view, but that's truly how we feel, and that's what we're very determined to do.
tau tua ma le au nanga le mot tau Samoa service station nei tona I matu. Ma tau teu tuina lo ta vale ma le tele o nisi o matu au nanga ese ese. Ai le ngata foi le ma tau te sia ke ina fo I lo ta vale. Siapa lah yang foi suau mau lau tapan. Apai ko vai pa o lusa. Awala te pon ma tu te siapa lah yang foi mau lau tapan. Molo no posila pia. Mua tape lau ta vale pe out. Lua tape lau telefon ni tai me utu ina lau ta vale. Male vaenga mulu. Mana tua fo e matua I pasa ina lo tau maktapa ai no fuanga fakte. Ota Samoa ole mota mo Samoa ma do te fia e au na pe mo o Samoa Partaila fia mai. We'll see you again. God bless.
Thank you, Minister. I can only imagine asking my grandmother to move out of the island she grew up in. That would be a struggle. So I hear you. Sorry, I'm going back into our question 3. I missed question 3, which is, are you specifically called for a special rapporteur on climate change in your address? I think this is something that I have heard RMI speak to it before under the law of the sea as well. To what degree do you feel that this will actually have an impact and assist atoll nations such as yours in the pursuit of recognizing the human rights aspects of climate change?
Absolutely, yeah. We've been advocating on these particular initiative. It started from our previous administration, and with the recent election, obviously, we came on board last year, just when the time COVID came on board. But be as it may, it's a national interest. One is to bring in a rapporteur focusing on climate change, in particular to the human elements, to have another voice or another avenue to basically confirm what we have already seen and hopefully be an audience to third party or those that are not here in the islands. Because sometimes it's very hard to convince others when you're at the table in other capitals or other organizations or other meetings abroad. But having a credible avenue such as special rapporteur focusing on climate change with human elements, we hope it will broaden the awareness and, more importantly, the urgency of the situation. It touched on many aspects of human rights issue, and that's why we particularly push this initiative. And thankfully, we've been successful so far with a number of partners, and we hope to have this particular initiative realized in the near future.
Thank you. I wish you well on that. I think you certainly raised it with your recent address. So in the event, you speak of the fact that you won't leave, Marshall Islanders will not leave. And this is something that is familiar to a lot of atoll nations. Tuvalu, Tokelauans have also spoken to the fact that land is where they derive their cultures from, and therefore the identity and sense of belonging, and they will not leave. But in the event of complete submersion or rather the loss of territory, which is then directly tied to the sovereignty of your nation. And I mean, this is obviously not going to happen in our lifetimes, but in the future, say that it does happen. And there have been a lot of studies that have focused on that scenario, and Marshall Islands has actually been a case study for how that might eventuate. So what are some of the options that you are considering as a nation to ensure that you retain sovereignty and ensure the survival of your people beyond the loss of territory?
Well, it's a good question. Well, obviously, the reports indicate the scenarios that are happening in the long term or far distant from now. But from our eyes, we are acting like it's happening already. In fact, it is. We have a number of national programs, including coastal protections, food security, and also revisiting how our infrastructures are really set up, including residents, that perhaps they need to be at certain elevation and needs to be at certain distance away from the coastal waters, and also how the roads and the other critical infrastructure have been built. So already we're putting the climatized, so to speak, into our normal government operations and working towards, even working with the church organization. Every so often they have these conventions for youth or whatnot, and then government, request that the climate change issue also come about, and people discuss these in however avenue that it's available, even at homes, at work, at church, and it's part of the awareness. Government wants to put it out there, and it's trying to do what it can within its own resources, while continuing to advocate on the international front. It's an ongoing battle. That's how we see it. It's a crisis that's happening. And obviously, we can only do so much. But with partners, especially the more established and the larger economies, we hope and we see that they're also starting to turn around. And it also complements what we're doing on the home front.
Thank you. And so what would be your key message to the international community in respect to the issue of the nexus between human rights and climate change?
Well, our message is, right now we consider ourselves frontliner on the battle against climate change. And we're not isolated in whatsoever. COVID-19 was a classic example. It shows that we're all interconnected, however the distance we are, but to see how the virus spread so fast, so quick, it required not a national response, but really international pandemic response. It was a strong case study, and this is really how we're gonna have to tackle this climate change. Although we may be distant from the bigger continental countries, and we're only small island countries in the Pacific. But if it's happening to us at this very moment, gradually it will lead to these other places. So we need to work together as one international community, and not just the individual border or Pacific Island countries or individual nations. That's not how climate change works. Similar to responding to COVID-19 pandemic, it requires international collective front.
Okay, well, thank you so much. Do you have any additional comments or observations you would like to share on this issue?
No, I just want to say thank you. You put up a good questions, and with your work is important to us. It helps advocate and send the message out. So I want to compliment on your effort, and best wishes, and obviously stay safe. And hopefully we'll continue to keep in touch as time permits.
Yes, thank you so much, Minister. I appreciate your time.
Likewise, thank you. Take good care.
Yeah, bye.
whaamama avenga le nei ma le Pacific Isi mo au tupe whaamumoli Samoa a o tapuni ai ofisa mo le whaava yaso. Whaonga nei lola na waunanga forward ta ua o le direct transfer. A whai o yesau membership card ma e whaonga ina le internet banking o le matua i whaingo fia lava. Na o le tipose mai lava lau se leni mato account o na whaatino leo la foina o lau se leni mo a inga i Samoa. E ia inga i tahu na whaamalia ina. Mo nisi whaamatalanga i le nei au nanga fo. Wala au le telefoni o valu se lau o tasi o nono po le lua fitu ono fitu iwa fitu wha. Pe text mai fo ilo suafa i le valu tolu o.
Local voucher is one of the most convenient ways that I'm finding now to do my shopping here at Mama Joe, and my sister just sent through the voucher on my cell phone, and I just come straight to Mama Joe to do my shopping.
Ole si tūranga tukusiri o le tāu. Ole ngā fō mea o le pepa tala o loa. Ona whaangā le e whaatau o loa e au ngā mole ainga.
I think it's really convenient for families overseas if they don't know how to help their families here. Then this is the perfect way.
Mai ai la sa no fua tau e lisia sa.
Le fia foi sa we mo mawina le foi au nang fo e ala mai le talo for voucher. Ula wana whaakau ma me te mga oi ile voucher.
Dai mo le talo pa voucher ua maua e apususi o se o fine. So se paro loa whaingo fie a me se le wherua i malo telefoni tai mi uma. Ai lo le lako merkes o na inu e lor tamao re ainga.
Whapea tu lava le talo pa voucher mo le foi au nang fo whaatai. Ma lua langa le tampai.
Whaatai talo pa voucher. Teki talo pa voucher.